To make your soap any superfat percentage that you want is actually a pretty simple calculation. You'll need your recipe, pen and paper, a calculator, and an NaOH chart. The calculation that you use is that you take 100% and you subtract whatever percentage you want your superfat to be. Today we're going to do 20. So if I want my soap to have 20% superfat, that's the number I enter right here. That'll give us 80%. We have to take that number and we have to turn that into a decimal. So we do 80 equals 80 over 100, which is 80 divided by 100. And that gives you 0.80. So now you take 0.80 and you're going to multiply that by this unknown number. And this unknown number is the total NaOH amount that is needed to saponify all of the oil and fat that is in your recipe. Calculating for that unknown number is also pretty straightforward. What you will do is you will take each of your oils and fats and you multiply each of those by the number that you find on your chart. Let's start with the olive oil. The olive oil NaOH number is 0.135. We'll put that in right here. Coconut oil, 0.183. Castor oil, 0.128. All right, we'll do all those calculations on the calculator. And now we need to add those numbers together. And that'll give us 129.365 grams. And what this number is the total NaOH number. We take that number and we plug that in up into the calculation. And we'll just round it to 129. So now you take your 0.80 and you multiply that by the total NaOH number, and that gives you 103 grams. And what this 103 grams tells you is that you're going to need 103 grams of lye to make this recipe 20% superfat. So now you're probably asking the obvious question, well, it says 122 grams of lye. What does that mean? How much is that superfat for that recipe then? Well, let me show you how to calculate that. That's really easy also. To find out what the superfat is for your recipe, you take the amount of lye that the recipe calls for and you divide it by the total NaOH number that we just found. This number is magic. It is the most important number for calculating how much superfat your recipe has and calculating your superfat to any percentage that you want. So let's plug this number in. 129. You do that on the calculator and that gives us 0.945. But now we have to take that number and we have to turn that into a percentage. So you take 0.945, you multiply it by 100, and that gives you 94.5. Take 100 minus the 94.5, and that gives you 5.5%. And that tells you now that this recipe, as it is written right here with 122 grams of lye, is a 5.5% superfat. So let's check our math. So we'll take 100% minus 5.5%, and that gives us 94.5. We turn 94.5 into a decimal by doing 94.5 divided by 100, and that gives us 0.945. Then we'll take 0.945 and we'll multiply that by, again, the very important number of the total NaOH for this recipe, 129. When you do that calculation, you end up with 121.9, which is essentially 122, and you can see and confirm that the recipe has 122 grams of lye, confirming all of the calculations that we've done to prove that this is a 5.5% superfat recipe. Now, the one thing you want to keep in mind when you make any changes to your recipe is that you want to make sure that your liquids is still within the parameters of being 2 to 3 times the weight of the lye. So whenever I recalculated my recipe to be 20%, my new amount was 103 instead of 122. So I'm going to take that number and I'm going to multiply it by 2, and I'm going to multiply it by 3, and I'm going to see if my liquid is still within the parameters of being 2 to 3 times the weight of the lye. And I can see that it is, and that I'm not going to go ahead and make any changes to my liquid. The only change I'll make is I will decrease my lye to 103 to make it a 20% fat recipe. Now, if you want to calculate in ounces instead of in grams, that's the exact same way. Super straightforward, super easy. So just like we took our grams of fats and oils and multiplied them by the NaOH number, you do that exact same thing, only you use the ounces. Because you can see up here in my recipe that it's written in both ounces and in grams. So I took my measurement of ounces and multiplied them by the NaOH number, and I end up with an ounces figure. And so when I wanted to figure out what the superfat was, you do the exact same math. You do the amount of lye that is in the recipe, and you divide that by the total NaOH. Convert that number to a percentage, and you can see that it comes out the same calculation as we got when we did it in grams. And then when we check the math, so you do 100% minus the 5.5, and you turn that into a decimal, and then you multiply that by the ounces if you want to work your problem in ounces. And you can see that it comes out to 4.299, which is essentially 4.3, again confirming that the recipe is written as a 5.5% superfat. Down below here you can see that I worked it in ounces to calculate for the 20% superfat, to change the recipe to 20%. So I took my 100 and removed the 20, turned that into a decimal, and you multiply that by the total NaOH number, but this time working in ounces instead of in grams, and it comes out to 3.64, which means that I would use only 3.64 instead of 4.3 to make it 20% superfat. So then I check my math, and I use this new lye number, and I divide it by the NaOH number and turn that into a percentage, and still come out with the same. So my math has checked.